Somebody's phoning me.
What happened to your do not disturb?
It was on do not disturb. Oh my goodness gracious me. This time of day.
Maybe to tell you that it's...
Maybe to tell me that it's actually paused. Come closer.
Okay.
Oh no, wait, that way.
That way.
That way. Push
We're going right into it, It's so lucky when things don't go perfectly well.
I know, it actually
Seeing as though I said to you, I am camera shy anyway.
I know, yes, I know. Don't worry, it's all meant to be like
this.
this.
No pressure, can't get worse.
Thank
just
you.
can't get worse.
I know, this is the beauty of live TV and internet and everything, because that's what we're supposed to do. Corne, can you hear me now? Are you no longer stuck? Perfect. Okay, hopefully it's all good. Okay, so going back to voetstoets, I'm so sorry. And you were telling me about Roman Dutch law.
Basically, what I was saying is that when dealing with immovable property, most contracts will include a voetstoets clause, which just provides a contractual protection for our sellers that the property is being sold as is, with all of its patents and latent defects.
Which is my question, because that is in our contract. So what is a latent defect and what is a patent defect? If you can please try and explain that to me.
So patent defects are things that, we can see with our naked eye. So if you've got, broken windows, cracked tiles, anything that you can easily discover when you're going through a property would be what we call patent defects.
Okay.
And latent defects are things that are discovered later. It's a nice way to remember it's latent.
Okay, yes.
And a good example of latent defects I always give would be a leaking swimming pool. If you're looking at a pool, you can't at that time tell whether it's leaking or not. It will take some time to see that the level of the water is dropping.
Yeah.
And that would be what we call a latent defect. And voetstoets covers both of those issues.
Okay, and how long is latent then covered for after transfer? I mean, how long? So say the pool is leaking and then somebody wants to come back and complain to the seller and claim from the seller. What is the time frame that can happen?
Well, the idea obviously with including a voetstoets clause, and obviously I think we might get into the details of how and what recourse a purchaser might have. But if you've got a voetstoets clause that's covered in your agreement, right, the seller is protected against any patents and latent defects. So even if, for instance, in weeks or months, the purchaser then discovers that there is a leaking pool, for example, he would have to then bring an application to court to try and overcome that protection. Because the seller's immediate defense will be that I've sold my property as is. Under the protection of voetstoets.
So previously, prior to the seller's disclosure coming in with the Property Protections Act in February this year, so people were covered like that if they didn't disclose anything, they were covered, which is, I suppose, why then the seller's disclosure has now been brought in along the way.
So I think people assume that this new seller's disclosure that's been brought up by the Property Practitioners Act somehow impacts the protection of voetstoets afforded to sellers. But people tend to forget that it was always a common law principle that sellers had to disclose a defect on a property. So there's always an obligation on them to disclose anything that they were aware of to any prospecting purchasers that are looking to buy a property.
Did that.
So we know that wasn't what's happening. But I think the real reason that the Property Practitioners Act is now brought out...
Sorry, I'm just bringing this closer to us because I think you seem very far away there. There we go.
No, you're putting me in the limelight, Deets.
No, I am putting it in.
But I think the real reason that the seller's disclosure form has now been introduced was actually more to protect the estate agents or the property practitioners as they're now known. A lot of the time when things go wrong and defects are discovered, purchasers will tend to point the finger at the agent to say that the agent was the one that was supposed to disclose these issues, right? So by the Property Practitioners Act now bringing through a compulsory form, we know that any agent now, before they take on a mandate, has to have this disclosure form signed by the sellers.
And that's for landlords as well. We do.
And for landlords, tenants, for your lease agreements as well. So before you take any mandate on, an agent has to get this disclosure form signed by a seller.
I know we're not even allowed to list a property in our office on the internet or anything until we've got the seller's disclosure. Whether it's an open or a sole mandate.
So the idea really, I think, is that it just sort of ensures the agents are asking the right questions to the sellers, and the sellers are committing to answer those questions once presented. But remember, there's a twofold test when it comes to voetstoets. So it's not just as simple as proving that someone was perhaps aware of a defect. There's an extra step which is far more difficult to overcome if they want to go and obviously pursue that in a court.
Okay.
So it's not just a matter of someone having to disclose it and then, or if you can prove that they hid it.
Yeah.
It's not as simple as that.
Okay, so we're just going to quickly go through the seller's disclosure that we have, which is not very onerous, I don't think. And I always say to people, you're not signing your life away unless there's a problem. You just literally put it on the agreement. And it's not even an agreement, it's just a disclosure, which the seller or the landlord writes up.
Yeah.
And then I, as the agent, would sign it, or the agent in the office would sign the acceptance and any questions that need to be answered. And then that is presented to a potential purchaser or potential tenant that they are aware then of those defects up front as well.
Yeah.
Okay. So just briefly, in terms of the roof, it just says, are there any defects that you're aware of with the roof? And it's a yes, no, not applicable. 9 out of 10 times it's a no. But again, there could be borer damage in the roof that somebody's not aware of. And
well, I think that's the point. I think you've just hit the nail on the head there, right? I think a lot of sellers and agents fear when they're presenting this disclosure form that they're placing their client in a difficult position. But really, the seller's only obligated to disclose, or a landlord is only obligated to disclose what they're actually aware of.
Yes.
They're not expected now to obviously send someone up into a roof to check exactly, what kind of condition the roof is.
Yes.
It's at the point
if a purchaser wants to know, they can do it at their cost.
Absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, nothing prohibits a purchaser from employing the services of any kinds of inspectors that they want. Obviously with the seller's agreement.
Yes, yeah.
But yeah, ultimately, when we're signing these disclosures, and I keep having to remind agents and sellers about this, you're only obligated to disclose what you actually aware
what you're aware of. Yeah.
So as far as you know, is there any problems in the roof?
Roof leaks on a day like today, you'll pick up quite comfortably.
Probably.
And if somebody pops their head into the roof, I've actually been into a house where there've been ice cream containers.
Yeah, all kinds of things. So there's the stories.
Yes, yeah. Okay. So the other one, in terms of the seller's disclosure, says electrical systems, which I always say to people, well, electrical compliance certificate has to be done on transfer or for transfer. So I suppose that one's really more for landlords and tenants as opposed to a seller.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Plumbing, including pool. This one's an interesting one because we don't have a plumbing certificate in KZN.
Yeah, that's only in the Western Cape, I think, as far as I'm aware. But yeah, of course, again, if you're aware that there's some plumbing issues or, some things with the pool that you need to maybe mention, then that's the point of where you would disclose that information.
Okay, so like water pressure, a lot of people ask about water pressure and that type of thing, which, I mean, a double-story house, that if the geezer's down below, it's going to get up and come back down. It's logic as well as to where is the geyser, is it inside the house, outside the house? Those type of things. But as a normal owner, would you even think to say, oh, the water pressure is not that great?
I was going to say, probably something that not many people would even think of, is any plumbing issues. I don't think many people, 90% of people are going to think about pressure issues.
Yeah, because I know a lot of people used to go around previously and like open taps, flush toilets, etc., etc., and I suppose that was checking the
and that must be the advice that we're always giving our purchasers, right?
You should open every single tap. Still continue.
Even with that, open every single tap, open the cupboards, check through, the built-in cupboards in the kitchen to make sure that there's no damp issues.
Yes.
All of that stuff should still continue to take place with our purchasers.
Okay, so even though we've got all of this.
Yeah.
Okay, the heating, the air conditioners, humidifiers. And then what's quite interesting with a lot of homes now is at one stage there were a lot of ducted aircon units going in, and then obviously people are finding it's very expensive to run. So they're going back to split aircon units and they've closed off the ducted. So we obviously let people know, make sure you notify them that the ducted doesn't work, because otherwise they turn around and go, but there's ducted aircon, and they're expecting it to work. So I've learned that one about assumptions.
Generally, I find your contract will also have some clause under your fixtures and fittings to say whether or not they're in working order or options to put in there.
Yes.
Perhaps you'll cover that at that point
that's
as
with
well.
Fixtures and fittings, yes. Yeah. What's interesting in our contract, though, it does comment about the voetstoets, but it doesn't actually have the all in working order. So we as agents have to write all in working order, whether it's in working order or not, yes. But that's just our contract.
Yeah.
I don't know about others. Okay, foundations, drainage, cracks, mold. Mold is always an interesting one, I find, because you walk into a house and people have just repainted, so you don't know if they've covered mold up and damp, etc., and not disclosed it.
Yeah.
So they should be disclosing it. But again, how do you prove as an agent if you haven't been to the house beforehand and you walk into this newly painted home that they haven't covered up the mold?
That could be, that's such a debatable thing as well, because I think a lot of sellers would say, look, I've put some damp seal over it, I've painted over it, and as far as I'm concerned, I've repaired that issue.
Yes.
So I'm not under an obligation to now disclose it.
Okay.
You know, that's just another way that it could be argued or looked at. So I guess it depends on the type of treatment that they've done on that property. But of course, I always try to think along the lines of what a seller will say or what a purchaser will say. But I think a lot of the time, when they are doing that, when they're cleaning a property up, a lot of the time, they will just say that, look, I've repaired whatever issues were there.
Yes. But you don't know how long it's
exactly
putting the tape over it.
Yes.
Okay, structural defects is quite an interesting one, and I think I have discussed this briefly with somebody previously, one of the architects, I think. Because again, the cracks. So, for instance, this looks pretty normal, this wall, but if there was a crack going straight up, that's normally like a hairline crack or a sort of settlement crack, but it's not a structural defect. And again, somebody can quite easily just put some polyfiller and paint over it and you won't know. But a structural defect is always that sort of Z line, which, again, a seller could just go, oh, no, there's a little thing there, patch it up. And again, we don't know. So it's up to the seller's honesty to...
Again, I think these things, there'll be a lot of people that will have cracks in their homes that never bother to go and investigate whether it's structural or hairline cracks, you know. And remember the questions, again, you'll look at that disclosure form. It's quite clear to say, are you aware, to the best of your knowledge, are you aware of any of these issues? And so if they're under the impression that this is just a normal crack,
little crack,
hairline crack, or it's not structural, then of course they're going to say that they're not aware of any structural issues. Or that's
been like that for 10 years, that we've lived in our home, it hasn't changed, and that type of thing. So they can just disclose on that little...
It'll only be in the instance that they've actually employed a professional engineer to come through, a structural engineer to say, are these hairline cracks, are these structural issues? And if they point out that it is a structural, then of course on that disclosure form they have to note it. But you can see the extent of where people have to go to try and overcome these things or prove these things. Because a lot of the time people will just assume that they're a normal crack. It's been there for years. There's no issues.
So going back to that, and with the roof years ago, I had one where we got to the entomology certificate and they wouldn't put the tent over the house because they said that the roof wasn't structurally sound. So we had to get engineers in there, etc., etc. And it became a point where the purchaser was about to walk away and the seller was also quite irritated with everything and was like, oh, well, we'll just put the house back on the market. And we had to advise them, well, actually, you can't just put the house back on the market because now you know that there's a problem. You've got to fix it regardless, because how are you going to sell the house now without disclosing? And this is before the thing came in. And eventually the buyer and the seller met halfway and they sorted the roof out and then they could put the tent over and transfer happened. But that's quite an interesting one about once you find out, you have to disclose it.
So that happens. Sadly, there are a lot of transactions that we receive that will end up falling away because of issues like this. Things that are discovered during that transfer process. And certainly when it's issues like what you've just mentioned, a roof that's not stable or needs to be replaced entirely, very rarely you're going to find a purchaser that's just going to proceed with the transaction knowing that. And like you correctly point out, I talk about this quite a lot when we speak about getting someone to come and inspect homes. These are inspector homes.
Yes.
And